Welcome to NVC Life. I'm Rachelle Lamb, veteran NVC trainer and relationship coach, helping listeners navigate interpersonal conflict and ground more deeply into relational living. Greetings, fellow humans. In this episode of NVC Life, I want to share a story from a book I came across in 1992 titled Millennium, Tribal Wisdom and the Modern World, written by anthropologist David Maybury-Lewis. The book also inspired a 10-episode series on PBS television, which was also called Millennium. The series was utterly fascinating to me, and it was, in fact, how I discovered the book. The piece I'm going to share is about the Savante tribe in Brazil, specifically about Savante log racing. I appreciate the story because one of the things I question in the context of nonviolent communication is the basic underlying assumption that all humans share the same needs, a universality of needs. I would agree that in terms of basic survival, all humans do in fact have requirements for food, air, water, shelter, for instance. We could also probably agree that touch, love, affection, respect are universally shared and understood. But as I read this story, I encounter a different way of thinking, a vastly different orientation around what it means to live communally, to cooperate, to understand the world and one's place in it. I especially appreciate a story that tests and loosens my certainty about things as this story does. The following excerpt is from the chapter, The Art of Living, and I'm going to start a few paragraphs in. Again, this is an account of log racing as executed by the Savante tribe of Brazil. So here goes. When we visited the Savante in later years, it was difficult to remember how startled and nervous we were the first time we heard the young men singing round the village, for this is a most reassuring sound to the Savante and one we soon came to like, indeed to rely on. We would only half wake up as we heard the familiar songs now coming closer, now fading away into the distance. Like watching men calling the hours in a medieval city, Savante age sets sing and dance around their village during the night, bringing a feeling of community and harmony to their drowsy fellow citizens. When Savante want to praise a community, usually their own, they say, "There is a lot of singing." They mean by this that people get together, ceremonies are performed properly and frequently, and the young men are alert, wakeful, and in good voice during the night. It is a severe condemnation when they say of a community, invariably not their own, that it is sleepy. That means that it is a community without much spirit and, of course, without much singing during the night. The singing is important to the Savante because it is tangible evidence of the harmony for which they strive. Savante believe that the fundamental oppositions in human experience, such as life and death, day and night, male and female, are part of the whole tissue of oppositions that make up the cosmic scheme of things. Since the cosmos is made up of opposites, Savante society must also be constructed that way, and so it is divided down the middle in complementary halves or moieties. The Savante are not content, however, with a single pair of moieties. After all, if each community were divided into two according to clans and political factions, then social life would be contentious and conflicts would escalate into local civil wars. They therefore assign people to different overlapping pair of moieties for different purposes. Two men who belong to the same political moiety are likely to find themselves opposing and complementing each other in the moieties that perform important ceremonies. They will find themselves lined up with yet another set of moiety mates for log races. Log races! We had heard so much about them. I had read 17th century accounts in Latin describing the tall savages of the interior of Brazil who apparently delighted in running through the wilds with tree trunks on their shoulders. Why would they do such a thing? No one could be sure. When 20th century observers witnessed log races in central Brazil, they were equally puzzled and concluded after the fashion of the time that the races must be trials of strength that young men had to undergo in order to show they were fit for marriage. If they saw women running with the logs, as we did, They forgot to mention it. At least one thing was clear to even the dimmest observer. All the Indian-speaking languages of the Jay family in central Brazil just loved log racing. The Chavantes were no exception. Whenever there was a ceremony of any importance, the climax had to include a log race. The mature men's council would decide to hold a race on the morrow and shout out the news to the community. Then the excitement was electric. Shouts of "Kai, Kai, Kai" from the meeting place of the young men. Laughter and yells of encouragement from the women gathered around the cooking fires before their huts. The next day, men set out at dawn to cut down a palm tree and chop 2 logs from its trunk, each about 4 feet, one for each moiety that would run with it. Before noon, the logs were ready and the runners began to arrive. They heaved the logs up on their shoulders and carried them from the marshy grounds around the palm trees to the trail where the race would be run. More and more men or women arrived now, elaborately painted in scarlet and black and binding up their hair with long strips of grass as they walked. This was usually the time when I showed up with my tiny notebook, suitable for cramming into the pocket of my shorts. I asked which moieties were running with the logs that day and noted it down. Then I lifted the end of each log off the ground, only an inch or 2 since they were pretty heavy, to see whether they were about the same weight. Then I noted who was lining up with which log and how they were painted. The Chavantes noted my solemn absurdities with ribald amusement. "What for?" they asked, laughing. I invariably answered with a joke, since I did not speak Chavantes well enough to give them a proper explanation of what I was trying to find out. The time for note-taking was soon over. I took my place with my moiety, and then, at a given signal, 3 or 4 men heaved each log onto the shoulders of the 2 lead runners. They set off along the trail at a shambling run. The teammates trotted along behind them, except for those who went leaping like dervishes through the bushes and around the trees by the side of the trail. As soon as the runners began to tire, another man presented his shoulder. The log was rolled from runner to runner, and the fresh log bearer would dash into the next stage of the relay. The Chavantes expected me to take my turn. They showed me how to carry the log, angled it so it rested on the pad of flesh where the neck meets the back, so it would not bounce up and down and chip the bones in my shoulder. They also showed me how to transfer it without dropping it and breaking somebody's leg. They were usually kind enough to relieve me pretty quickly so I could join the others who were crashing through the undergrowth and urging on the log bearers. The race went on for a few miles, before the village came into view. Here the runners put on an extra spurt. Both teams streamed into the village with the élan of a cavalry charge. The logs were run to the mature men's meeting place and flung down with cataclysmic thuds. Now the senior runners launched into speeches. 6 of them orated at once, while other men stood around painting and children scampered about and danced with excitement on the fresh logs. I was fascinated by the postmortems. There were elaborate discussions on who had run well, though the people who came in for the most praise were not those who had carried the log farthest or fastest. I was asked over and over again if I thought the race was beautiful. It was beautiful, I answered, bewildered, puzzled by the ethos of it all. I was even more puzzled by the fact that the Chavantes did not seem to mind if one log was heavier than the other. At first I thought this was accidental. But one day I noticed at the beginning of the race that one log was obviously much heavier than the other. I pointed this out and asked if they wanted to trim it. Now it was the Chavantes' turn to be puzzled. "What for?" they asked. I tried to explain that the team with the lighter log was bound to win. The Chavantes simply did not understand my concern. We raced off anyway with the mismatched logs, and sure enough, the team with the heavier log fell farther and farther behind. I was loping along happily with the lighter log when I noticed that men from my moiety were dropping back to help the team that was behind. Soon the others had so many people on their team that they were shifting the log to a new runner every 30 yards or so. They began to catch up and were right behind us as we burst through the ring of huts and made for the central plaza in a cloud of dust. The village went wild. Dogs barked. Children ran beside us. Women raced up and offered their shoulders for our log. We let them have it, and in that way held off the challengers, but only just. The 2 logs arrived in a virtual dead heat. Pandemonium. Everybody seemed to be speechifying or shouting or just yelling with glee. It was by common consent the most beautiful log race that had been celebrated for a long time. It was then that I understood it was not a race at all, at least not in our sense. It was a ceremony, an aesthetic event. Chavanches meant it when they asked if it was beautiful. They were nonplussed by notions of winning and losing, as we might be if a Chavanches turned to us at the ballet after watching the principal dancers leap athletically off the stage and asked who won. It's a question that makes no sense. The logs are cut in the forest and run into the village, thus linking the realm of nature with the realm of human culture. They are carried by two teams, representing the oppositions that Chavanches believe go to make up the universe. The running of the logs expresses the dynamic tension between opposing principles. The purpose of the ceremony is to stress that these antitheses need not tear the world apart. If one is careful, oppositions can be controlled, they can complement each other and create equilibrium and harmony. And what better symbol of equilibrium than two teams that exert themselves to the utmost and finish in a dead heat? At last I understood that this was the ideal, the most beautiful outcome of a log running, for it established the perfect synthesis. I remembered the accounts I had read of communities of North American Indians playing lacrosse across each other for days at a time and ending the game only when they had achieved a tie. At last, I felt I was beginning to understand the Chavanches view of life. I'm stopping the reading here. I'm going to leave it to you, dear listener, to work on or wrestle with or be inspired by what I've shared with you, especially in the context of what it means to live with others and not be competing, but to be in collaboration with each other and also in collaboration with the place, the terrain, the geography of where we live. I marvel at the question that the Chavanches asked Maybury-Lewis, the anthropologist. Did you think it was beautiful? Did you think our log race was beautiful? Yes, that is a beautiful log race. Thank you for tuning into NVC Life. For future episodes, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube. For free resources or to book a private session with me, head over to RachelleLamb.com. Until the next time, stay sane, grateful, and generous.